Welcome to all of you on behalf of the International Planning History Society. This is a new initiative. We have decided to start a series of webinars with the idea how to bring contemporary, relevant, urgent issues to planning historians. The idea behind this particular event, or the choice of water, goes back to a number of inspirations. One of them was a walk that Stephen and I were having recently in Georgia along the shore, on an island. We have been discussing the question of the role of environment for planning history with John. We've been thinking about various ways of urbanization, Asianization, whether Asia and water is different, and questions that Richard, for example, knows a lot about. So the idea was to say, as planning historians, we have traditional ways of working. We look at planners, we look at planning tools, at methodologies, and there's a lot of literature also coming together in planning perspectives, notably. But how can we rethink planning history, engage with contemporary topics? So then we decided to take these topics and invite people from other areas who have recently published fascinating books or films or other things, and say, how do we react to these findings, to these inspirations and this work? And so with that in mind, we said, let's start with the topic of water, in line with the 2023 high-level water conference, which was just held in New York. So we know that we have a problem with water. We know that there will be more droughts, more flooding, less fresh water. We urgently have to do something. So in what ways can we, as planning historians, play a role in shifting the debate, in addressing environmental issues and contributing to these larger discussions? So with that in mind, when Stephen and I were walking along the shore, Stephen made a great suggestion. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Stephen, who will then introduce our guest of honor. And just one more thing before we do this. So the idea is that we have first a presentation by our guest. Then we will have a number of commentators from the IPHS management team. And then we will also open the discussion to the audience. So I'm turning it over to you, Stephen, and please introduce our guest of honor.
Thank you, Carola, and welcome to everyone, wherever you are. Good morning, good evening, good 2 in the morning, as in Richard. It's my great pleasure to welcome Dilip Da Cunha to the International Planning History Society's first webinar of this series that we're doing. Dilip Da Cunha is an architect and planner based in Philadelphia and Bangalore. He's author with Anuradha Mathur of Mississippi Floods, Designing a Shifting Landscape, Deccan Traverses, The Making of Bangalore's Terrain, Soak, Mumbai in an Estuary, and editor of Design in the Terrain of Water. His 2019 book, The Invention of Rivers, Alexander's Eye, and Ganga's Descent, was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press. He received his PhD at the University of California, Berkeley's College of Environmental Design. Professor Da Cunha has taught at the University of Pennsylvania, Parsons School of Design, and Harvard University. He's currently the adjunct professor at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at Columbia University. In 2017, Mathur and Da Cunha initiated a design platform called Oceans of Wetness, directed to imaging and imagining habitation and ubiquitous wetness rather than on land water surface. In 2017, they were awarded a Pew Fellowship grant, and in 2021, a Mercedes Bass Landscape Architect and Residence Fellowship at the American Academy in Rome. In 2020, Da Cunha was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship for Oceans of Rain, an upcoming book and exhibition. If I can take the liberty of reading from my review of the Invention of Rivers and Planning Perspective, I was very celebratory of it. It's a fantastic book. Professor Da Cunha's book is that rare combination of imagination, originality, and historic and theoretical rigor. It's the culmination of an intensely methodical, patient, and attentive work of design research, often conjured but seldom delivered to its full promise, as it is wonderfully here. The invention of rivers is an essential historic contribution to our future. It dares us to move toward an aspirational post-colonial moment of after rivers, when they are returned epistemologically and methodologically to wetness, where the Ganga's descent transforms from the locks of Shiva's hair in river into the infinite strands of each individual hair in the form of rain. That's his metaphor, not mine. In the midst of global climate flux, I cannot think of a more compelling, urgent challenge. With his presentation titled Decolonizing the Past and Future, please join me in welcoming Professor Dilip Da Cunha. Thank you, Dilip.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for that wonderful introduction. And I must say, I so appreciated your review actually of Invention of Rivers. I mean, you captured the argument and thought so beautifully. Yes, but it's a pleasure being here. Thank you, Carola, also. And I'm really glad that y'all took this walk in Atlanta and conceived this project, because in my mind, I think water holds the future. I say water with some hesitation, and and I think Stephen has already made the point. We move away from water to wetness. I mean, and that really happened about 5 or 6 years ago, a little more perhaps. When we realized actually that whenever we say water, what comes to people's minds is a separation from land. So that prior separation to us is problematic, and so as you will see today, I mean, I will definitely want to distinguish water from wetness on many fronts, and I hope you appreciate the significance of it. So let me share screen. Let me get started here. Yeah. Well, sorry. Yeah. This is where I'm supposed to start. Right. So yes, I'm calling it decolonizing the past and future, and I hope I can convey the significance of the act of decolonization and what that means, because it certainly goes beyond what we definitely associate with colonization. I mean, what historians associate with colonization, that is generally a post-Columbian act. And what I'm referring to actually is really the colonizing of wetness by land. But I thought I'd start with just making these points that sort of summarize to some extent what this talk will be about. I want to convey this idea that we take land serviced by water for granted. We assume that water is there, to supply us, of course, with drinking water, et cetera, irrigation and all that. It drains the land, it shapes the land, it improves the land, provides land with energy and transportation. And of course, today, very popularly, it increases the real estate value with waterfronts. But really, this is what I see as the enslavement of water. Water serviced by land, to me, cannot be taken for granted, because this is the land that today is in trouble, from water. And I sort of love to say that perhaps when we think of the sea level, rising, the increasingly violent, unpredictable storm events, floods, melting ice caps, you really have to wonder, if water is having a kind of Me Too moment, and reacting against its oppression. So so the question is, are these problems to solve, problems that we associate so easily with climate change? The fact is, rivers have been flooding for a long time before. There have been, violent storm events. Then, there have been, sea level rises and fluctuations at least, and people have adapted. And so I don't want to deny climate change. Of course, it is there. But are these really problems of climate change, or is there a design project that has been at play that has really put land and water in place? Yeah, has changed the language from wetness to land and water. And that prior design is a project that I want to play out for you. So I want to start with this possibility that we inhabit two planets. One is an ocean of wetness, and the other is a surfaced earth. So on the one hand, we live in this ubiquitous wetness that is vital and necessary. The ancients, that is the Greeks, called it Oceanus. In India, if you look at the Vedic scripts, they call it Varuna. And the Egyptians called it Nu. And of course, other cultures have this understanding of this miraculous wetness that you could not escape, because we are wet ourselves. So you need it for life. So you cannot step out of it. So you're immersed in it. And that sense of immersion and inescapability, I think, is a cause of both wonder and terror. So there was always this fear and awe of the ocean of wetness, among the ancients in particular. So it resists enclosure. So here I'd like to talk about the Earth more in, like Jupiter and Saturn. Jupiter and Saturn are, gas giants. And you look at them from here and they seem like, they can be enclosed with a surface, and they can be measured. But the fact is, they cannot be enclosed. Being gas giants, you cannot enclose them with a surface. And so it's the same with the Earth. You have constant evaporation of wetness. You have precipitation. You've got this flux that we live within. So when we talk about an Earth surface, it suggests an object that is somewhere in the middle of this wetness. Who put it there and how is the question. So if I had to ask an indigenous person or someone who's not educated in geography or geometry, if I had to tell them that there is water in the Earth, they will understand. Or if I tell them that there are there's oil in the Earth, they may understand. But if I say that there is water below the surface, people will say, below what? Below a surface. So you're looking at a surface like that, and then you're looking at something under. What is that? When you go out there, we assume a surface, but a surface is an object. It's a geometric plane. And so I want to bring that up. So on the right side here, you see a surfaced Earth. And when I talk about a surfaced Earth, people, we learn in geography that the oceans are 70% of the Earth's surface. Now that, to some extent, is nonsense, because water is just another occupant of a surface. So land reclamation, you call it land reclamation, that allows you to take land from under the sea, land from under lakes, under rivers. So we have moved rivers, we have drained lakes, we have played around with water because we know that there's land underneath. So it is, what we learn in geography, in my view, is absolute nonsense. It is not that the Earth's surface is 70% water and 30% land. It is 100% land. So the Earth's surface in its entirety is land, and this land locates water, and this water serves land. So how did this happen? So there are these two planets, and here I say two ways to receive rain, just to make this distinction to continue this distinction and elaborate on it. On the one hand, rain, when it falls, it replenishes a wetness that is already everywhere. So, there's wetness in the air, there's wetness in the soil, there's of course wetness in the sea. Even a desert, what we call a desert, is wet. It is just less wet than the sea. So when rain falls, it just increases this wetness, saturates this wetness. And so to appreciate this wetness, it is more in section than in plan. It's between clouds and aquifers. There's no surface in between. On the other hand, on the planet that we take to be, surfaced, water falls to a surface and then forms flows. And then, and this is an appreciation that we have of a surface that's very much in plan. So here you have a geographic surface versus a hydrologic depth. They're two very different planets, two different modes of receiving rain. They're two different modes of times of habitation. Then on the one hand, you have a wetness that is resident. So here you see the hydrologic cycle, and the hydrologic cycle that's drawn by Paul Klee in 4 moments, as every child learns it. So you have the first moment is precipitation. The second moment is flow formation. The third is evaporation, and the fourth is cloud formation. So in the world, actually, in an ocean of wetness, the moment begins, time begins with rain, with the moment of precipitation. And then you live the entirety of the hydrologic cycle. So you hold rain, you move rain. This is about wetness that is everywhere. It's in plants, it's in, it's in all living things besides the sea and the air and the soil. And on the other hand, in the planet that is surfaced, you have, when I say that rain falls and forms rivers, rivers are resident. That over here, you have constructed a time of reality, and then all the other moments of the hydrologic cycle are made into moments of ephemerality. So moments of ephemerality, include, rain, snow, humidity, clouds, fog. All these become visitors, whereas the river and seas are resident. So, what I love to point out here is that a surveyor, does not go out when it's raining, goes out actually when in a fair weather moment, when there's no rain, not because he cannot take his instruments and cannot do his job. It is because he cannot draw a line between land and water. He cannot make the separation between land and water. And so he waits for the fair weather moment. So we have constructed time in a fair weather moment. And in things. So over here you have, two appreciations of ground, if you will, or time, or modes of habitation. You have, on the one hand, you appreciate this hydrologic depth, and you inhabit a gradient from more wet to less wet. There is no such thing as dryness, And on the other hand, you inhabit a geographic surface where there's a distinct separation from land and water. In the one hand, you have wetness that is held in everything. On the other, you have water that drains. And when I say wetness that held, wetness does not flow. Water flows. Wetness falls, as say in precipitation, and it holds, it saturates, exceeds, and that's the way it moves. So two very different things. And here I sort of demonstrate these two sort of modes of habitation that on the top right hand, on left hand side, on the top, you have high grounds in an ocean of wetness. And all people, from Egypt to India, to China, to the Mississippi, all lived on what they called mounds in wetness. And so they allowed wetness to be free, and it rose and fell. It increased in intensity and it decreased in intensity. On the lower side, at the bottom here, you have a completely different paradigm of a surface that is drained by rivers, where you have settlements that we see on a river, And so this, you made rivers the spine of civilization, really. So on the top, again, on the right-hand side, I point to, these high grounds that we engaged in Colombia when we visited Bogota recently. And this is how the Muiscas lived. They lived on high grounds. This was their agriculture. So they distinguished between high ground and low. So in other words, they lived sectionally. They did not live in plan. They did not live on a river. And this is what all planning teaches us. I mean, it teaches us that cities began on rivers, and river civilizations and things like that. And I want to question that. Because, once you draw a line separating land from water, you'd see that line becomes levees, and then the levees become, things that you need to protect, because you want to create dry land. So what I want to suggest here is that a surfaced Earth has colonized an ocean of wetness. So one planet has colonized the other planet, if you will, and it has done so, with basically two instruments, Oops, sorry. It's done so with two things. One is the surface and the line, and I'll come back to play that out, what I mean by the surface and the line, But what I want to just summarize for you here is that these are two languages of place. And it's possible that all of us speak both these languages. We speak both these languages, in different times, different moments. And actually, there are contradictions, and I want to point out a couple of contradictions here, But I want to illustrate this with two points. I mean, since y'all are historians dealing with history, I'll start with Herodotus, the father of history, who visits the Nile in the 5th century BC, and of course, he identifies a river, but he asks, what is the Nile? He first asks, what is the Nile? And assumes, of course, it is a river. But is it a river that flows, between two river banks, between October and May? Or does it flow between two deserts, the Libyan and the Arabian desert, that is, between June and September? Of course, he concluded that the Nile is a river that flows between two banks and floods. Okay, so in other words, he has defined what is normal, and he has defined what is abnormal as a Nile. Okay, so, and we all learn this in school. We learn that the Nile floods. Who says that the Nile floods? Herodotus said that, tells us that the Nile floods, And so he also was very keen to know the source of the Nile. Where does the Nile begin? Now, both these, why does the Nile flood and where does the Nile begin? He asks the Egyptians, and he says they're not able to tell him. They're not able to give him an answer. Why? Of course, he thought, he assumed that they were just ignorant. This is why I like to look at this moment as actually the start of underdevelopment. You look at the Egyptian now and you say that this person does not know his land. Is that the case? Or is it possible that the Egyptians never saw a river? That they saw the Nile as an ocean of wetness. They saw the Nile, and they lived in the Nile. And Herodotus made this observation that they lived on mounds that looked like islands in the Aegean Sea. So you have them in a non-linear pattern, inhabiting a ground between deserts, a wetness between deserts, the Arabian and the Libyan deserts. He wanted to see them on a river, aligned to a river. And so, for them, basically the rain that came from the Ethiopian highlands just rose in the months of June, just rose, and they directed it into the fields. So they were looking at a phenomenon that they saw under the land that rose from beneath and came up. And so when you see on the right, the hieroglyphic, you will understand that they saw a wetness that rose and fell, and not a river that flowed and flooded. Yeah, two very different paradigms of habitation. The second point I want to make is, I've been working in Colombia with students from Columbia University, went to Colombia, Bogota, and I asked for two maps, one of water and one of forests. And I got these two maps. GIS gave me these two maps. Now, So on the left, you have, the Magdalena River that you see here that drains to the Atlantic, and on the right you have the forests. Now I ask you, if any of you have stepped into a forest, are the leaves not wet? Are the fruits not wet? Isn't water everywhere? Now, why do I get a drawing like this? Now, we know that these drawings are nonsense drawings. They're nonsense drawings, that we work with. We assume this to be the case. Why is that? When I bite on a cucumber, it is 95% water. The sea is 96% water. I don't call a cucumber a water body, but I call the sea a water body. Why? So there is this fundamental contradiction. We know that these drawings are nonsense from our experience. You walk into forest, you also walk on mushy ground. You know that wetness is everywhere. So why do we work with drawings like this? So this is what I mean by contradictions that we live with. We know these drawings are nonsense, but we work with them like they are the truth. So this is also a section drawn by Humboldt in Colombia. And I just want to extend this argument or the possibility of these two worlds as one being of the colonizer and one being of the colonized. So for the colonizer, they wanted to see, this section, by the way, this cross-section drawn by Humboldt goes from Cartagena on the Atlantic coast, or the Caribbean coast, to Bogota, which is at 8,000 feet, and then you have the Paramos, that is just clouds. It's all about clouds and wetness that is more in the air than on the ground. So you have these two paradigms, and just a suggestion that has never been considered. Is it possible that indigenous people live in an ocean of wetness, a vertical phenomenon, and that they're at home in this wetness, a critical zone between clouds and aquifers? Whereas the colonizer came in and articulated a river. They needed to enter the country, and the only clearing they could get was a river. And the river became this horizontal phenomenon, an entrance to the country and a highway to extract and plunder. So on one hand, they introduced a drain imagination, whereas the indigenous people had a rain imagination. Two very different worlds, two different planets that they inhabited. So these are the weapons of colonization, surface and line. So the surface is all length and breadth, but no depth. This is Euclid's definition. And a line is length, but no breadth. Now these, when you think of colonization, you think of guns, you think of industrialization, you think of land, you think of all these things. But what I want to suggest here is that these have been more violent weapons than anything else. And this is just to sort of give you the picture all in one. You begin with wetness, but this is the given condition, that we live on a planet that is an ocean of wetness, but we have assumed and laid down a surface. So the first step, the first act of design is to posit a surface. So you posit a surface separating wetness above from wetness below. And this wetness above, wetness below then can be manipulated with the manipulation of the surface. Then the second act of design is the inscription of a line that divides water from land. So you've changed the language now from wetness to water and land, And so this line now is something that surveyors draw. And I wonder if any one of you have ever drawn a line between land and water. And I challenge you to draw one, just to understand what a fiction it is, because there's seepage, there is thing. Where do you draw the line between land and water? And I've asked surveys this, you've got to do them. We've done it with students, and until you do it, you realize. You don't realize the fiction of this line. And so ultimately you land up with land and water. So we moved from a sectional imagination to a plan imagination. We moved from hydrology to geography. And then this is just to stay with Colombia, this is what you have. So over a period of 400, 500 years, we have created a river. We've created the Magdalena out of the jungle, And so I don't look at these as just increasing accuracy. I see this as actually the construction of land and water, over a period of 300 to 400 years. And of course, we have done this across the world, We have made the separation of blue, from brown, or blue from green, or whatever you want to call it. But we have articulated a world that is surfaced and drained. And this is the world that is in trouble, by the way, today. But I just wanted to move into just one issue, and that is the construction of a river, and how that, and why I wrote a book on it, because I see it as an invention that comes out of wetness. So this is how, the dictionary defines it, and this is how Paul Klee drew it: flowing water in a channel with defined banks. Now, there are many kinds of lines, and that we constantly deploy, and this is, we use lines for gestures, we use lines for contours, we use lines in triangulation, we use all kinds of lines, but I'm not talking about any of those lines. I'm talking about a particular line. I'm talking about a line that separates, a line that contains, and a line that calibrates a flow. So without a line to contain water here, you won't see a flow. A before and an after. So a line also is that fixity that allows you to see change. So this is how they deployed this breathless length on the surface. And I'm assuming here the surface is already given. The surface has already been posited and constructed. And think about it, actually, because the first act of a surveyor is to posit a surface. They must decide whether, it goes over the anthill or below the anthill. Does it include the mountains or go under the mountains? Where do you put the surface of the earth? They decide where to put the surface, and they decide where to draw the line. But once you draw the line, you see to it that the separation is then maintained. But that line is not noticed. So one thing that I sort of discovered is that there is a literacy to the river that it follows the literacy of the drawn line. A visual literacy. So source is a point. So when Herodotus asked for the source of the Nile, he wanted to know where the line that he had drawn begins. Where does it begin and where does it end? So if you didn't have a line, you wouldn't ask the question of a start. And it seems like such a futile exercise, the search for a source of a river, when you know that the source is in rain. People take it to a point, right? So then you have, the course, which is the drawing of a line, the flow of a line, and then you have flood, which is the erasure of a line. It raises three questions. So I'm really fast forwarding over here a bit, It raises three questions. One is, wetness is everywhere. Why do we see water somewhere? The second is, precipitation falls everywhere. Why do we see river beginning in a point? This is what I was just saying. And the pursuit of a source is such a futile exercise that people have indulged in, that you really have to wonder, how childish are we, to indulge in exercises like this and spend the amount of money that has been spent on the search, for example, of the source of the Nile. And the third one is flood, is water crossing a drawn line, a line that we have drawn. So why do we see flood as natural? And we learn, like I said, that the Nile floods, and we've constructed a whole flood control infrastructural, regime. We've also constructed notions of flood pulse. We've constructed notions of floodplain, all on the basis of constituting an artificial entity called a river. So I wrote this book actually in order to pursue these questions, and sort of Stephen has sort of looked at it, and I'm not going to go into all of it, but it deals with world issues. I mean, and the river as a global thing, but then also deals with Ganga in particular. For us, Ganga is rain, Ganges is river. The two are used synonymously by historians. And what we want to suggest is that they are not synonymous. You know, as a designer, I look at Ganga as rain and Ganges as river. And Ganga has been colonized by Ganges. So here you have, you know, the two that the distinction that I just made, you know, Ganga is rain and Ganges is a river. And we looked at it in three different, you know, parts. We looked at it in the, you know, the constitution of a delta, you know, on the lower bottom, the lower row, how the delta has been constituted with the drawing of a line, how the river in the plains has been constituted, and how it has been created in the mountains. So, you know, so there are three chapters that each of them, but anyway, the long and short of it is that we have constructed a spine of civilization and a drain of settlement. And today, the Ganges is one of the most polluted rivers in the world, one of the 10 most endangered rivers, you know, and we have done this to ourselves, literally, you know. So it was a vast wetness 2000 years ago, and it has been made into a river, literally been narrowed from this massive holding system, which did not rise more than a foot, today rises in Varanasi by 60 feet, you know, and silts tremendously. So we have created an object that we can control. We can make it do wherever, you know, whatever we want to do. We can train a river. And this is why we have designed the Earth's surface. And this is why we have designed, you know, a river, so that we have an object to control. You know? And so today, India's connecting all its, you know, linking its rivers, precisely because the drawing of its Earth's surface and the positing of an Earth's surface made it possible. And then we've created an object that we can grant rights to, you know. So and you know, today we talk about it as indigenous people movement, that indigenous people, you know, want to, you know, benefit from granting rights to rivers. That, to me, is criminal, because I do believe that the granting of rights to rivers is the ultimate achievement of colonialism. You know, it's the victory of colonialism. You know, and then we have created this monster now that is considered, you know, sacred. You know, whereas one time you considered Ganga and worshipped Ganga as rain and a wetness that was ubiquitous. Today you have put this goddess, you know, in between two lines, and then you have this millions of people that come to the banks, and you know, and you can't imagine the ecological disaster that this perpetuates. So you have now, you know, the victory of the river and the drawn line, you know, and this is the result that we are seeing. And what is fascinating, if you look at the bottom, you will see that it is blamed on rain. That you know you've created this object out of rain, and now you blame rain as the culprit that is creating this problem of, you know, floods and other sort of disasters. So I won't spend too much time here, because I think I'm already running out of time. I wanted to go through Bombay, but perhaps that is not necessary, Stephen, because I want to keep time for questions, you know. But I'll include it here if people want to sort of see it. It just sort of makes the point that you can look at Bombay as an island that is drained, and you can look at Bombay as an estuary that rises and falls. So, you know, it brings, you know, on the one hand, a wetness imagination, and you know, and writes about a city, and the design of a city and the planning of a city on the basis of rain as opposed to land and water. So I won't go into that, but perhaps we can just have a conversation now on what I have said.
Well, excellent. Really inspiring, I have to say. So maybe you want to stop. Thank you. Wonderful. This is, yes, you've put a spotlight on lots of things that we've been struggling with, and that is connecting them together. So and maybe I'm just mentioning a few. We've had a special issue on porosity, exactly to rechange this notion of a single line, and that we actually should be thinking at the porous spaces of water coming and going. We've been, and I'll send you those links afterwards. We've talked about the urbanization of the sea and the way in which the sea has become blank in that way. And we actually have a studio right now where I would have started with, we are 70% water. So this wetness is everywhere. And but maybe to make the link then to the discussion on planning, because I've been arguing that instead of planning, we should be sectioning. So we should actually invent a whole new discipline to see the water in the ground, the water in the air, the water across all a section, rather than purely a plan, which would be really important also for avoiding the same mistakes that land planning has based for example, maritime spatial planning. So there's plenty of things I could add, but it's really inspirational and wonderful. But I thought maybe turning it first to Richard, who would like to give it a first comment.
Thank you, Carola, and thank you, Dilip. And I agree that indeed this presentation is very informative and very inspiring, and it refreshes and our understanding and new angles to look at those very familiar, daily, and ubiquitous. And I agree that I particularly like the section view of the wetlands and the plan of the land. And it challenges our conventional boundary of land and water in understanding cities and regions. And I'm a bit surprised that, and Carola and other colleagues have argued that, it is true that the planning history has not paid sufficient attention to the water, to the wetlands, to an extent that we should. And I think this is the start. And this great presentation drawing upon cases from Africa, India, and America. And while observing the presentation, I'm recalling two projects of mine and about China. And one is the Yangtze River Delta region, and that world-class city region. And it's on water, by water. And it reminds me, okay, the whole city region has been there because of water. And the Yangtze River is a system, it's more than a river. And the Chinese government has launched a so-called Yangtze River economic belt, and from the very beginning and to the estuary. And that system covers 20% of the Chinese land and 40% of Chinese population and economic outputs. But indeed, it's more than a river. It's more than a river defined by the lands. It's a system, and it's an ocean of wetlands. And if we argue that the whole Earth is an ocean of wetlands, doesn't water define Earth as a habitable planet? And it doesn't wetlands define, or even human body? The human body is like a cucumber. It's one of wetlands. And so I think indeed when we talk about the Yangtze River Delta city region, we think, this is a city region, but this is not a city region. This is an ocean of wetlands because we have a city region there because it's a river, and the river is more than a river. It's the incubating system for the Chinese civilization in the south part of the country. And the newest example, and as far as the Chinese city is concerned, is the newest Chinese city, the Xiong'an new area, and they're building a new city and very close to Beijing. That particular location is chosen for removing certain functions and out of the capital city, because the capital city is suffering so-called big city syndrome. It's too big, it's too crowded, and it's not sustainable. Then they decided with strong political will, and they decided to build a new city to relocate some certain functions out of Beijing. And they chose Xiong'an, not because of its land, but because of its wetness, because Xiong'an has a wetland, and that's a rarity that's a rare asset in North China. Whether the decision makes itself is sensible or not, I just want to use this case to show the importance of looking at, cities and regions. It depends how we define planning, urban planning or planning in a very broad sense. And definitely, and the water angle and the wetness angle refreshes and our understanding provides an alternative angle to look at those things that are truly daily. We're very familiar with that, and it's daily and it's ubiquitous, and we deal with that. But indeed, and it raises a fundamental question: should we continue to look at cities, look at the planning in the boundary of land or water, or I don't mean that they're wrong. They may not be wrong, and there's still sort of like validity in defining spaces by land or water. But at least there is a question about what's the new angle and drawing upon and this very inspiring presentation. Thank you very much. That's my comment and drawing some cases from what I'm currently working on. Thank you very much.
I just want to say one thing here in response to I mean, and it's exciting actually hearing you describe the Yangtze in the manner that you did. But one of the things that I do in Invention of Rivers and developing it further with Ocean of Rain is that the river and the city have colluded, to construct our civilization. So it's not that water has been absent. Water has played a central role actually in the way we think about habitation. And in cities are one of those those entities that bring a river and I would think rivers and settlement, or let's say a river and habitation together. And so I would encourage, and this is where we are going, is to challenge the mode of habitation and the language of habitation that we have given into with the city. So just as much as we need to give up on the river and river infrastructure and turn to rain and ocean of wetness, I think we also need to move away from cities and this understanding of cities and the hierarchy of ruralization, urbanization, and that is all anchored. It's all anchored on a land-water schematic, if you will, or a paradigm that I think is really dangerous. But I think there's a question in the chat to distinguish between delta and estuary, and that is a distinction that I make, because we definitely, we definitely tend to see, cities and deltas. I mean, Hong Kong, of course, is the leading, a classic example, in kind of understood as a delta. A delta privileges a river, and that is, it's sort of seen as the mouth of a river, and so there is this domination that land brings to a delta. So when you think of a delta, you think of it in terms of land and water, and you think of land-water separation. You think of, and you think of how rivers operate, drain the land to the sea and all that stuff. But when you think of an estuary is very much between what we call rain and tide. And so there is a salinity, gradient and variation. So in the case of, when we worked on Bombay, we looked at an estuary as this in-betweenness of rain and tide, but looking at it on the ground of the sea. I think Carola mentioned this thing that this is a point that we make in SOAK, that the sea does not speak in plan, because the sea is always a blank in plan, whereas the sea always spoke to captains of ships or navigators, always in section, with the sounding of depth. So the appreciation of an estuary on the grounds of the sea is to think of the estuary in section, whereas a delta is classically, I mean, a term that was coined by Herodotus, based on a plan perception and the letter D, of the sea. So there's a huge difference in our world between estuary and delta, and there's a huge difference then between cities that you want to associate in a delta with habitation of an estuary, which is how we are looking at the Sundarbans, for example. People still look at it as a Bengal delta, and they are designing levee systems and islands, et cetera, and what we see it as an estuary, and what that does actually to the imagination and habitation is something quite different. But I just wanted to make that point.
And I think there's another dimension to the question, which is the delta works. Now, you might not that much be familiar with it, but that is, I would love to hear at some point your reflection on it. But the delta works protects the coastline of the Netherlands to avoid flooding of this entire zone. So there is, among others, it turned a part of the sea into a sweetwater body. So you have all these separations. So I think that gets us into a whole additional field of discussion, because you've got the Waddenzee, which is a natural heritage site, in between. So all of these levels of wetness and integration and density, which is, I think, another notion of that. So I don't know if you're familiar with the delta works, but that's...
I'm very familiar with the delta, and I'm very familiar with the fact that the Netherlands is the worst example of design that that one could think of. Really, I mean, it has set us on a tragedy. It has really set us on a course of tragedy. And I think even the thinking about it and the writing about it and the claims about it are extremely questionable in my mind. But it is one of those constructions that we have to become increasingly uncomfortable with, and really learn to critique more fundamentally, actually, as an example of bad design.
It's very interesting, bold statement. I don't know, Stephen, if you want to pick up on that.
Well, not to only pick on the Netherlands, so that we're here in the United States, we have our Army Corps of Engineers, which came in many ways from the French example. And Dilip, I know you've done some work with the Corps of Engineers in Norfolk, for example, and as well as consulting with them, or speaking with them rather, on your Mississippi project. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about how that exchange has gone. Some people, I'm sure, oftentimes say, well, how do we operationalize this? What are you doing? And you've done a lot of work with that as well. So I wonder if you could speak to that sort of institutional engagement, hopefully course correction, and what this actually will mean going forward, and your experience, the challenges, the opportunities, and those sorts of things.
Yeah, I mean, one of the it's a very diverse organization, the Army Corps of Engineers, and there are some very forward-thinking individuals there, as much as there are the sort of reinforcing lines kind of group there. But in Norfolk, one of our main effort, and that was much appreciated by the Army Corps, was to change the language of Norfolk from a city on the sea, and working across a line to the understanding of a place in an estuary that is operated between high ground and low ground. So we started. I mean, our whole sort of effort was really directed to building high grounds, what we call fingers of high grounds, and constructing an open system wherein the sea was welcome, in the sense that that what happens with sea level rise is that you have to accommodate that gradient between freshwater and saltwater in order to allow for species migration. So many people don't think about this particular aspect, actually, of how you deal with that this meeting ground of rain and tide. So working with high ground and low ground was an effort to do that, but it was also, the idea was also to instigate this change of language in how we approach places. And we got an interesting reception. I mean, I can't say that it has gone very far, but I certainly think it has sown a seed. It has sown a seed of challenging levies. So I mean, I think the Army Corps themselves are very keen to move outside, beyond levy thinking. So some of their encouragement of breakwater design, on the coast of Staten Island that Kate Off is doing. Some of these projects are addressing addressing what I would see as a wetness issue rather than a land water issue. So so I think there are some positive signs, but the way they described themselves was very interesting to us. They said, listen, we are like a huge aircraft carrier, we turn very, very slowly, so that is, and I sort of appreciate it. And because much of what we are talking about also does not have a language of implementation, and you guys probably are more familiar with this than I am, but we have interacted with civil servants everywhere who need, in order to sell projects to the public, they need things like cost-benefit analysis. They need to speak a language. Carola, you spoke about it at the start, that we need a new language. And this was before the talk started when you said it. And that is exactly, I would think, what we need. We need to constitute a new language. And I would love to see planners take on this task. But in the case of Bombay, for us, it was not only about changing the future. We had to rewrite the past. So Bombay, history is written on the basis of an island. And so they're designing the future on the basis of an island. So we are designing the future on the basis of an estuary, but we have also rewritten the past of Bombay as an estuary. So I think that becomes the critical contribution, I would think, of a planning historian, that they look to a different future, but they constitute a different past on the ground of a new language. And that is how we see our work. And that's how we're seeing Ocean of Rain as actually contributing to a new language with which to see the past and the future,
Thank you.
Yes. Very well said. I mean, this is also what drives me. Understanding the past in different ways allows you to rethink the present and then design the future. So design different futures. So you're saying it in different words, but that's very inspiring. So, but I really appreciate that you're turning it also to planning. And maybe I was therefore looking also at John Gold, who's known for all his work on Olympic cities and Olympic events. So
I've done other things as well.
I know. I was just going to get there, and many other things. But we had this conversation before, so I was curious what you, with all of your knowledge in all these different fields, would make out of the theme of water.
Well, I'm going to start in one of my own things, but rather an older one than Olympics. A long time ago, I got interested in the ideas of landscapes, what we called landscapes of defense, the idea that notions of defense had shaped the land in which we live. One of the areas I was interested in for a personal reason was that my family in 1953 was about to move to an island in the Thames estuary called Canvey Island. Because my grandmother had tuberculosis and it was thought to be a better environment. In 1953, very severe floods overwhelmed the dikes on the Dutch coast, and then moving south, the Canvey Island itself was almost completely swept away. And I wouldn't be here because there's quite a high death toll. I wouldn't be here talking to you now if we had been 6 weeks later, we'd actually moved there. But the reason why I'm referring to this is one of the ideas we had, and this is work from around 1998, 99, just before 9/11, was that there were some important convergences, and that you could think about various ways in which defense was administered. And one of the things we came up with was the notion of how water fitted into this, the question of a dichotomy between protection from water and protection through water. The protection through water was that we became aware that there were a lot of uses of water for defensive purposes. Some really fascinating things beyond the sort of preliminary fortification of a castle through a moat. There were things like the Royal Military Canal, which was built to repel Napoleon's forces if they landed in Kent, which is a 28-mile canal, a wonderful thing, which is about 3 meters deep and goes from nowhere to nowhere, but and is only used a little for pleasure boating now. And there was the Dutch water line, the connection of fortifications in Holland. So there was this side of it. You could use water for protection. But what fascinated me more was that the growing debate that we had in maritime spatial planning about managed retreat of coast, that the permeability of the coast, because of to some extent land which was submerging for a variety of reasons, and also because of sea level rise. You have this question of how much coast can you protect, what resources do you have, and how do you allocate this? Now, for planning, and particularly in parts of the East Coast, extensive part of the East Coast of Britain, you have this question: how much do you protect? What do you protect? Why do you protect it? And it's an extraordinarily emotive issue, which is resolved frequently through decisions which are made at a very broad level, and that people have very little say in that. And that managed retreat means that land will be allowed to flood, and that flood protection will be gradually withdrawn. And it's, I suppose, from a planning point of view, it's the whole moral aspect of that, and how do you come to terms with it, that even if it only involves a small number of people, is it right to withdraw protection? And even if you don't withdraw the protection, will it do any good anyway because of climate change, land, sea level rises? So it was a wonderful presentation. I think for purpose of planning history, what we're really thinking about is the convergences. These sort of convergences of ideas and ethics and values and practicalities and resources and so on, and this wonderful mixture. And from a planning point of view, planning historic point of view, we're looking at the ways in which those decisions have been made, and what it is that they amount to when interpreted into the landscape.
You know, two points that I would like to make. I mean, one is, of course, I think, well, I'm glad that you got out of that that place. I mean, it's incredible. Yeah, there are a lot of incidents like this. But I mean, so it's just 2 points. One is that we try to steer clear of the language of defense and protection and retreat, you know, which are really combative land water, you know, sort of enmity kind of language that we have sort of grown up with. And we believe that building high grounds in places that it can be in the sea. I mean, they can be really anywhere. To build high ground and to change our imagination from high ground to low ground. I mean, a high ground, low ground, you know, rather than land water, you know, becomes a way of getting out of this language, this combative language. The second thing is, and it's really related, is time. so most planners think in terms of space, when you talk about land use, for example, or and you orchestrate. So this is what we do in Bombay, and you'll see it in some of those images that I didn't get to. You have islands within islands within islands. That's how planners are thinking. They're thinking land uses. They're thinking, so this is residential, that is this is that, that is that, or it's mixed, or But you're thinking islands within islands within islands. And they try to do it. The colonizers try to do it in Bombay, and I would think that planners today are still perpetuating that same language of trying to keep people within islands. And people don't work like that, and an estuary doesn't work like that. And so they don't work in space; they work in time. And so when we think of high ground and low ground, we think of low ground, that it's given in to recreational activities, or just what we did in Norfolk, this is what we did in Bombay too, that we identified certain activities that can give in to the sea at certain times of the year, or give in to the monsoon in certain times of the year. And there you have what you may call a retreat from low ground to higher ground, during the monsoon time, or in sea incursion time, etc. But operating in time is another way to get beyond this combative, world of water and land, and you start thinking in terms of tide and rain as sort of seasonal, as in temporal, in so many different dimensions. And people have lived like this in so many parts of the world that we have looked at. They work between sort of moving, giving ground to the sea, the same ground on which they play cricket or play hockey, and so it's this sort of appreciation, of space on the ground of time rather than time on the ground of space, which is how most planners think.
It is good to take a long view, but when you have a village hall full of people who want to know what answers to apply to a specific problem, like a coastal retreat, there's going to be decisions made which are about values, about resources, about specifics. And whereas I accept your view entirely about the long view, the short-termism is always going to be there.
Oh yeah, I mean, and this is where that even in our works, and we work to transition design. So we work in the short term. So in the short term, we are building levees and flood protections. But in the long term, the same protections can become high grounds. So we feel that is where design agility really lies, is in this shift from the short to the long term, and how we could intervene today, but use those same interventions, in a different manner further down the road. So I appreciate very much what you say, and we work within that. We work within the framework, of transitioning, rather than saying, okay, this is an altogether different thing, and so I'm going to impose it. No, we work with the transition, because that is where I think the challenge of planning really lies.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. We really need adaptive strategies, as I would call them. So we have to see, where do we want to be in 100 years, and how can we then backtrack it? And as you say, build levees now that will become islands in the future. So that is and that planning actually is never just one master plan in time, but it's always a process that will continue in the future. Pamela has a question, and Pamela, if you feel like it, why don't you turn your camera on and ask it yourself? Otherwise, I can also read it out. So the question is, how could we as urban planners address coastal and port cities, bring them into the agenda? I can resume from this lecture that the water bodies is a relevant motion in cities and has water features to include into urban design. I think this is also of the major scale, if I understand you correctly, Pamela. That is, what do we do? So a lake may be designable, but what does an ocean, a sea, lead to? What do we do with the question of design? But maybe, Pamela, I'm getting it wrong. Then please do let me know. Or do you see it differently, Dilip?
Well, I'm trying to follow the question. I'm not quite clear actually as to how to read it, because aren't there? I mean, isn't there a lot of design of port cities today going on? I mean, and you know, riverfront developments, waterfront developments, harborfront developments. I mean, there's massive agenda. You know, I think in many of these places. So I'm not quite clear.
True. I mean, I was reading the question while Pamela is drawing. I was reading the question as, so how do we design or not design the Mediterranean, the Baltic Sea, the Atlantic Ocean? So maybe at that, is it a question of scale?
I don't know, maybe Pamela's not there.
She's trying to draw it. So let's see. Are there other questions or comments? Kai had a comment in the chat. Kai, do you want to? Richard already responded to a bit. I don't know, Kai, if you want to talk yourself, or if there are other people who wish to speak.
I have a point about the notion of designing the water and designing the sea, the ocean, or the Mediterranean. It depends how we define design. And should we design, or should we try to design the water, or should we try to adapt? And that's my initial response to the notion of design the water. A comment or a question.
You know, I mean, my whole point, I mean, and this is where we have worked. We don't design land and water. You know, we design wetness. You know, and that you know. So, for example, in the case of in Bogota, what the students did this past semester is that they worked with a much more expansive notion of the presence of wetness. So you're working with plants, you're working with people, you're working with cropping. You know, so when you're thinking, for example, of rainwater harvesting, as many people do today in cities, you know, rainwater harvesting is this big thing, or greening cities is a big thing. These are, to some extent, holdings of wetness. So when I'm talking about rainwater harvesting, I'm not talking about rainwater. I can hold wetness, you know, I can hold rain in crops. I can hold rain in things. So when I talk about agriculture in cities, they become a way of rainwater harvesting. You know, so it becomes this more expansive understanding of place. So I wouldn't go to designing the sea or designing the, you know, I don't make objects of these things. You know, I work actually with these processes, if you will, or with what we like to say now is practices, you know, practices that then engage. So I mean, we're getting out completely of the language of form, of process, and moving to a language of practices. I mean, you'll see it in the few slides I had on Bombay. You know, what we try to do in Bombay and moving to to practices. And so I think you know like I say, it's a different planet.
I'm almost wondering if you would want to put up your images on Bombay, because you've mentioned them so many times now that I would really like to see them before.
Sure,
if you don't mind.
I mean, I can very quickly, perhaps. What do I do? Yeah, so we start with the coast. Understanding this difference between an estuary and a coastline between land and water. So on one, then that coastline has been reinforced. To understand in this case of understanding an island, Bombay is an island. Mumbai, which is now the name of this place, so we use it actually opportunistically to make the distinction between an island city and an estuary. So how do you inhabit an estuary? And this is, and so you see tides, you see the mangroves, fishing in the mangroves, you see clouds, and you see the monsoons. These are all temporal events, and so this distinction with separation of land and water and working between rain and tide, So this is the point on space and time that which is also plan and section, and which we build on over here. So on the right, you have practices of people in an estuary where they operate in gradients, again, from less wet to more wet, and gradients take all other forms. So there are no absolutes. There are no absolutes in an ocean of rain or an ocean of wetness. There's no absolutes. Whereas planners on the left side here work with absolutes. So here you have a port city, and here you have all these interventions in the port city where they're making riverfronts and harbor fronts and, islands within islands, sort of seen with this eye, from above. Whereas over here, you have practices that are experienced very much as immersed. So we did this, what's the difference between a drain imagination and a rain imagination? Like I said, we also situated the past of place, in an estuary. So we were writing about the past of Mumbai in an estuary and not the past of Bombay as an island city, which all the history books of Bombay will tell you. They'll give you that history of an island. So here you see, some of these things that they're actually doing, in the act of driven by this need to separate water from land, and so we worked with projects, not with plans. These are some of the drawings that we did that were more temporal devices rather than planning devices. And so this is engaging, activities on a walk that we brought together, through drawings of section and section on which we had certain, developed certain interventions and certain practices grounded in time. So we developed notational schemes on the basis of time and what it meant to work with materials in time. And practices. So you get drawings like this. So it really challenges our mode of representation, of plan alone. So we're really making a shift here to the language of the sea, and interventions took various forms, from small elements of walkways and flamingo, caring for flamingos, mangrove interventions, little small, rain holding interventions, rain cultivation interventions, and so on. Many people told us, "Oh, you cannot do anything in Bombay because there's no space." We said there is no space in Bombay. If you look at it in the language of planning today, but on the ground of time, there's a lot of space. In Bombay. And so we started this using space in multiple ways based on a calendar. And then, of course, this is the project that we're working on now. I won't get into, but this is really about changing. You think of India as a place that was colonized. And what we are saying is, no, India is the colonizer. It is the geographic surface that is colonizing Sindhu, which is an ocean of rain, So many of the questions that are being sort of asked is very much on the ground of the geographic surface. And what we are saying is that we've got to change our imagination. It's not, when I talk about another planet, what is so interesting is that the ocean of wetness is both another planet, but it is also the same planet without the imposition of a surface. So the surface is an assertion. If you begin to appreciate that that the surface is an assertion by design, you know, and that is what the ocean of wetness is about. It's about actually uncovering this history of this action of asserting a surface. It becomes a completely different, you know, it becomes a project that is very doable. How do you design without a surface? How do you design without rivers? You know, that's the challenge, I think, in front of us.
Dilip, can I ask a question? So much of the terrain seems to be on representation. So these beautiful modes of practice depicted, and it seems like in that there's representational aspects, but there's an aesthetic aspect to what you do. So design as resolution, certainly, but I'm wondering if you feel like there's a aesthetic intentionality or certainly a sensibility, and how is that informed by and then inform the work that you're doing in that way? I know this may seem far afield, but I feel like issues of visualization and aesthetics and certainly representation should be informing the way we think about history and do planning history specifically. So I'm wondering how aesthetics fit into these modes of practice you're putting forward.
You know, I mean, I don't know whether I would address a question of ethics. You know, I'm not clear myself actually as to how I would sort of approach that.
I'm sorry, aesthetics. I meant. I may have said ethics. I meant aesthetics.
No, aesthetics. No, I heard aesthetics. I was saying aesthetics only. But one of the challenges that we face is how do you work without maps? You know, we have been so trained to see the world in a map, to understand a here and a there through maps. But when we walk place, when we engage place, and we've done this with students in the forest, or with them in Bombay, with them in Jerusalem, in various places, we actually teach them to walk differently. You know, how do you walk with an appreciation, of the walk itself, of the transitionings, of the changes in experiences that you go through, as opposed to just looking at a world in a map and designing on a map. Now, if you think that contributes to a different aesthetic, to me, it's more about a shift in materiality and appreciation of experience. So I would say that it's really, it's like this. If I had to take a student in the forest and say, now, where is water and land over here? Where is water and land? And say that, why do we think of this as land? We're surrounded by water. Wetness is everywhere. We are thinking, immediately it makes so much sense, that you would document this place differently. You would document this wetness in a way in which it would defy the map. You see? So I think it begins there. It really is a shift in experience. A shift in experience, and then the search, like what you're calling representation, is exactly to some extent what we were doing in Mississippi. What we did in some of our earlier projects was to actually look for that alternate representation that would grasp this experience. Now we move away from representation altogether. We are moving to demonstration. So demonstration, as opposed to representation, works more analogously. So I'm working with paper, like the people in Bombay work with ground or earth or soil or something, or things like that. I would approach the question analogically rather than say, oh, I'm representing them. Who am I to represent, represent someone else? So I don't do that. I consider myself a player, over there, and I'm just putting my experience out there and saying that this is a possibility, So there are many changes and shifts that come with that shift of experience. So we don't work with certainty and uncertainty. And I tell students that the opposite of certainty is not uncertainty. The opposite of certainty is possibility, So I think in a world of possibility, uncertainty doesn't exist in my dictionary, So it's that, shift in experiencing, I would think that really addresses the questions I think that you raise, and how we get that experience. I think it comes from really learning how to experience again. Because, like I said, I showed you those two maps in Colombia. They make absolutely no sense. They're not related to my experience at all. I experience the world totally differently. I don't experience a forest as green on a map. I'm saying this is what is absolute, this is something that we should have the courage to call out and throw away. We need to throw those drawings away, because they are, it's just not how people experience things. I mean, and this is how we've educated all these people across the world to see, to see a setting. So, to see the world in terms that they don't experience it in. So that's what I mean by this contradiction, but we're living outside of our skins, so yeah.
That's helpful. I appreciate that.
And I think that's an excellent moment also to conclude on. So thank you so much for really an inspiring, excellent talk, and very rich and challenging, particularly also for planners. I mean, we need to rethink our words, we need to rethink our maps, our perspectives, and that also means we have several PhD students here on the screen, that it actually, there's a whole field to write planning history in that hasn't been touched. So this is also an invitation to send in articles for planning perspectives for the big section that John edits, or the IPHS section. So there's plenty of room to think and rethink planning history, with a goal to actually change planning into sectioning, into projecting, whatever you want to come up with words. So one more last note here. We will continue on June 27th, that time around lunch, with Simon Richter from UPenn, who is also known as Poltergeist. So he has shifted from being, or he is still professor of Germanic languages and literatures, but he is also making a lot of videos and movies to change the thinking about water. So that is, I think, will be another really inspiring, event. So and I'm just getting one message here in the chat. If you want to join us, what's the best way? Richard sends out all the messages through the IPHS emailing list. So Richard, you might also want to add your email in the chat. You can always email me. People can find our invites on social media. So if you want to get in touch, if you can't find it for the next event, please do send us an email, and we look forward to seeing you again. So again, many, many thanks, Dilip. This was fascinating. I will get back to you also if you would want to turn this into an article for a journal. So let's be in touch. And thanks also to Stephen, John, Richard, and particularly to Richard for staying up so late or so early, whatever you prefer. So thanks also to our visitors, and talk to you again